Unfortunately, I think we are closer than we have been in many decades.
And where do you see that breaking out, and how do you see it coming about?
Well, we're getting disturbing reports, both from NATO and other sources, suggesting that NATO now, as a collective body, wants to authorize the use of more deep strike weapons, Tomahawk missiles, and so forth. There is some rumbling in Washington about discussions behind the scenes about giving the Ukrainians, whatever that means right now, I prefer to say the Zelensky regime, access to tactical nuclear weapons, which seems incredible to me. I can't imagine it. But I think more important than any of those statements right now is what's happening on the ground in eastern Ukraine with the Russian armed forces. Mr. Shoigu, the former Minister of Defense, referred to as general, but he's really a civilian who was appointed to supervise, is back on the ground in eastern Ukraine, and he is watching carefully as the tremendous logistical buildup takes place. Millions of tons of ammunition, food, water, fuel are being built up very far forward, right behind the lines, with the object of preparing for what looks to be a major offensive to end the war. The Russians seem to have assembled roughly 180,000 troops for the purpose of striking decisively, ostensibly towards Kiev and the river, and putting an end once and for all to the Ukrainian resistance. They also are providing lots of warm food and showers and other things to the troops, new uniforms. This usually indicates you're getting ready to go to war in a big way, because you want your soldiers to be rested and well-fed. And I think there is a sense in Moscow that there is no longer any point in waiting for a new government to show up and take control. I think they've decided that whoever shows up, whether it's Donald Trump or anybody else, is probably going to do what's been done before. And I think that's very unfortunate, but we have to attribute that to a lot of stupid remarks made by a lot of people over the last couple of weeks about what should or should not happen in Ukraine.
And among those stupid remarks, Mike, you consider comments by Admiral Bauer, the chair of the NATO military committee, and intimations from EU elites like Prime Minister Starmer of Great Britain and President Macron of France, that they're not intimidated by the Oreshnik missile that startled the world when President Putin's people engaged it or fired it 4 or 5 days ago.
No, I think that's right. It's hard to ignore dumb remarks along the lines of British and French troops deploying to fight in Western Ukraine against the Russians. I think if you add the two armies together, you barely come up with 200,000. I suppose they plan to ship all the forces they have there, which will make it easier for the Russians to annihilate them quickly and get on with business. Very stupid remarks. There is also, as you point out, a failure to understand what the Russians have recently demonstrated. And I think you've had other guests on, like Scott Ritter, who've given us excellent details on the missile, many of which I was unfamiliar with. But the thing that we need to keep in mind is mass times acceleration equals annihilation. And what I mean by that is that when you begin building these hypersonic missiles, regardless of the various types of warheads that you put on them, in this case, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle that spews out multiple warheads on top of rockets, apparently. Whatever you are using comes in at such an enormous speed that the combination of the speed of impact with the munition itself and the explosives is so great that it has the effect of a nuclear weapon. Now, this is a long-term development. This is not something the Russians began developing recently. You go all the way back to the late 1970s when Marshal Gorkov was the chief of the Soviet General Staff. He talked at great lengths about new, modern, conventional missiles and warheads replacing nuclear warheads. And by the time you got into the late 80s and early 90s, the leading lights of his general staff began writing extensively on it. Marshal Mahmoud, actually it's Colonel General Mahmoud Gurayev wrote extensively on why nuclear weapons were of no real value on a battlefield or in a war any longer because they're so poisonous and destructive, and that these new missiles could take their place. Well, we have arrived, and we are not in a position to challenge that. We can't protect ourselves from it. The Russians know it, and they thought that we should be aware of what they've got. I suspect that we will now see another round of hypersonic missiles striking a variety of targets, probably command and control, certainly aviation centers or airfields, logistics, specifically rail lines, which to this point, for various reasons, the Russians have not set out to destroy. And I think also roads where trucks carry enormous quantities of supplies forward for the Ukrainians. So